The train pulled out of Denver at 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, and Walter Combs had already decided it was going to be a quiet, unremarkable ride to North Platte. He was 61 years old. A widower for 3 years now. He had taken this same train a dozen times since his wife passed, always for the same reason, to visit his sister in Nebraska, always sitting alone by the window, always watching the planes roll by like pages in a book he'd already read. He settled into his seat in the parlor car, the one with the deep green velvet cushions and the brass fittings that reminded him of an era he'd only half belonged to. He opened his newspaper. He did not expect anything to change. Then a woman sat down across from him. She was perhaps 55, with dark, wavy hair touched by early gray at the temples, and eyes the color of creek water in October. She wore a forest green wool coat, the kind that looked like it had seen a few winters and earned every one of them. She placed her handbag on her lap, folded her hands over it, and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts desperate and apologetic. "I am so sorry to ask this of a stranger," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But I need you to be my husband. Just for the next 3 hours. Just until North Platte." Walter lowered his newspaper slowly. He did not laugh. Something in her eyes told him this was not a joke, and not a scheme either. It was something closer to a plea. "I beg your pardon," he said. The woman glanced toward the front of the car, toward an older gentleman in a gray traveling suit who was making his way down the aisle, checking seat numbers, clearly looking for someone. "That is my father-in-law," she said quickly. "My husband died 4 years ago. Car accident. And his father, Harold, he has never accepted it. Every time I see him, he tells me it is time to move on, time to remarry, time to stop grieving in front of the family like I'm making a scene of it. He is coming to Nebraska for my niece's wedding, and I could not bear another 3 hours of his lecturing. So when I saw you sitting alone, I thought, forgive me, I thought perhaps I could simply say I remarried. Quietly. No fuss. Just to have 3 hours of peace." Walter looked at her for a long moment. He thought about how strange it was, the things people carried onto trains with them. Suitcases and steamer trunks, yes. But also grief, and old wounds, and the particular exhaustion of people who love you but do not know how to let you hurt in your own time. He thought about his late wife, Dorothy, and how after she passed, well-meaning neighbors had told him things too, that he should get out more, that he shouldn't sit alone so much, that time healed all wounds, as if grief were a fever that simply needed to break. He understood this woman more than she knew. "My name is Walter," he said finally, extending his hand. "Walter Combs. I think, for the next 3 hours, I would be honored to be your husband." Something in her shoulders loosened, like a held breath finally released. "Eleanor," she said, shaking his hand. "Eleanor Whitfield. Thank you. Truly." The older man, Harold, reached their row a moment later, his cane tapping softly against the floor of the train car. He peered down at Eleanor, and then at Walter, with the sharp, appraising look of a man who had spent decades in some kind of business that required reading people quickly. "Eleanor," he said. "I didn't realize you were traveling with company." Eleanor's hand found Walter's on the small table between their seats, and she laced her fingers through his with a practiced ease that surprised him, as though some part of her had rehearsed this exact gesture for a life she never got to have. "Harold, this is Walter," she said. "My husband." The old man's eyebrows rose. "Your husband." "We married in the spring," Eleanor said. Quietly. "We didn't want a fuss." Harold looked at Walter for a long, measuring moment. Walter, for his part, did the only thing he knew how to do in uncertain situations. He smiled the way he used to smile at difficult customers back when he ran the hardware store on Larimer Street, a smile that said, "I have all the time in the world for you, sir." "Pleasure to meet you," Walter said. "Eleanor's told me a great deal about the family." It was, of course, a complete fabrication. Eleanor had told him nothing about anyone. But something about the way he said it, calm, unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent 40 years telling customers exactly what kind of nails they needed for exactly what kind of job, made it entirely believable. Harold sat down across the aisle, still watching them, though something in his posture had softened. "Well," he said. "I'm glad to see it. I worried about her, you know. After Michael." "I know," Walter said gently, though he did not know, not really. But he had learned, over 61 years, that some things did not need to be known specifically in order to be understood generally. Loss was loss. Worry was worry. A father grieving his son's widow was, in its shape, not so different from a man grieving his own wife. Harold excused himself a few minutes later to find his seat further down the car, and left them alone. Eleanor exhaled, long and slow, and let go of Walter's hand, though she did it carefully, almost reluctantly, like a woman setting down something warm. "Thank you," she said again. "You didn't have to be that kind about it." "I wasn't being kind," Walter said. "I was being honest. I don't know Harold. But I know what it looks like when a person is grieving somebody else's loss and forgetting to ask about your own." Eleanor looked at him with new interest. "You sound like you've thought about that before." "My wife died 3 years ago," Walter said simply. "Dorothy. Cancer. Everybody kept telling me how she was in a better place, how time would heal it, how I should think about the future. Nobody asked me what Tuesday afternoons felt like without her. Nobody asked what it was like to still set 2 cups out for coffee most mornings before I remembered." The train rocked gently beneath them as it picked up speed, leaving the last edges of Denver behind, the mountains shrinking into a blue haze in the window behind Walter's shoulder. Eleanor was quiet for a while, looking out at the plains beginning to open up around them, gold and brown, endless, the way Nebraska always seemed to be from a train window. "Michael and I were married for 22 years, she said eventually. "We met in college, if you can believe that. I was studying to be a schoolteacher, he was studying agriculture, and neither of us had any business talking to each other at a dance where I stepped on his foot twice in the first 5 minutes. And he married you anyway." He said, "A woman who apologizes twice as sincerely as she dances is a woman worth marrying," Eleanor said, and for the first time since she'd sat down, something like a real smile touched her face. "We had 30 good years together, if you count the 4 before we married. And then one October evening he didn't come home from the feed store, and a highway patrolman came to my door instead." Walter didn't say anything right away. He had learned, in his own grief, that the worst thing anyone ever did was rush to fill the silence after a story like that. So he simply let it sit there between them, honored, for a moment. "Harold lost his only son," Walter said eventually. "That's its own grief, isn't it? Different from yours. But not smaller." "I know that," Eleanor said, a little sharply, and then softened. "I do know that. I just wish he could grieve his son without also trying to manage mine. I wish he could let me be sad in my own way, on my own schedule, without turning it into a project he needs to solve." "People do that," Walter said. "They see somebody else's pain and it frightens them, because it reminds them how close they are to their own. So they try to fix it instead of sitting in it. It's not cruelty. It's just fear wearing a helpful face." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "You've thought about this a great deal." "I've had 3 years of Tuesdays to think about it," Walter said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of weathered honesty. The porter came by with coffee, and they took it together, quietly, the way people do who have known each other far longer than 40 minutes. Outside the window, a farmhouse passed, red-roofed, with a line of laundry snapping in the wind, and Eleanor watched it go by with an expression Walter couldn't quite name, something between longing and peace. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said. "And you don't have to answer. Go ahead. Do you ever feel guilty? For still being here? For the mornings when you forget, even for a minute, and you feel almost happy? And then you remember, and the happiness feels like a betrayal. Walter set his coffee down carefully. Every day, he said. For the first year, I felt guilty every single time I laughed at something. Like Dorothy was somewhere watching me enjoy a joke without her. It took me a long while to understand something my sister told me, which I didn't believe at first. What was that? She said grief isn't a room you leave. It's a house you learn to live in. Some days you're in the kitchen, going about your business, almost forgetting the house is even shaped by loss. And some days you open a door and you're right back in the room where it happened, and it knocks the wind out of you all over again. But you're not betraying anybody by learning to live in the rest of the house. You're just living. That's what the people we lost would have wanted for us anyway. Eleanor's eyes had grown bright, and she looked away, out toward the window, toward the gold fields sliding past under a sky going soft and orange with the beginning of evening. That's a kind thing to say, she said, when she trusted her voice again. It's a true thing, Walter said. Kindness and truth aren't always the same, but sometimes, if you're lucky, they line up. They talked for the better part of an hour after that, not about grief anymore, but about smaller things, the kind of things strangers discover they have in common when they stop performing for each other and simply talk. Eleanor had taught third grade for 18 years before retiring. Walter had run the hardware store his own father built, and sold it 2 years ago when his knees made the concrete floor too much to stand on all day. Eleanor loved to bake bread on Sunday mornings, a habit she'd nearly given up after Michael died because there was no one to eat it with, until she realized she could simply give the extra loaves to her neighbors, and now half the block looked forward to Sundays because of her. Walter admitted, a little sheepishly, that he still talked to Dorothy sometimes, out loud, in the kitchen, telling her about his day the way he always had. That's not strange, Eleanor said. I talk to Michael in the garden. I tell him about the tomatoes. Are the tomatoes good this year? Terrible, Eleanor said. I think he's punishing me for something. They both laughed, a real laugh, easy and unguarded, and for a moment, Harold, several rows down, looked up from his newspaper and smiled to himself at the sound of it, though neither of them noticed. As the light outside began to lower and the fields turned the deep amber of late afternoon, Harold made his way back down the aisle and sat across from them once more. I don't mean to intrude, he said, but I wanted to say something, if you'll let me. Eleanor stiffened slightly, out of old habit, but Walter simply nodded, and something about his calm seemed to steady her too. I know I haven't made things easy for you, Eleanor, Harold said. Since Michael. I think I convinced myself that if I kept you moving forward, kept pushing you toward the next thing, it would mean he mattered less to the sadness. That somehow if you healed fast enough, it would prove the love was strong enough to survive losing him. That doesn't make much sense, said out loud. No, Eleanor said softly. But I understand it. Seeing you today, Harold went on, glancing at Walter, seeing you laugh like that, I haven't heard you laugh like that in 4 years. I think I've been so afraid of you forgetting him that I forgot to let you actually live. I'm sorry for that. Eleanor reached across the aisle and took the old man's hand, and for a moment nobody said anything at all, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of the train against the rails, patient and unhurried, the way time itself seems to move on long journeys through open country. Thank you, Harold, Eleanor said. That means more than you know. The conductor's voice came over the speaker a while later, announcing that North Platte was 20 minutes out, and Eleanor turned to Walter with something like reluctance in her expression. I suppose our marriage is coming to an end, she said, a small, wry smile at the corner of her mouth. 3 good hours, Walter said. Longer than some marriages last, the way people talk about them nowadays. I mean it, Walter. Thank you. Not just for playing along. For all of it. For understanding. Walter reached into his coat pocket and took out a small notepad and pen, the kind he still carried out of 40 years of hardware store habit, writing down customer orders. He wrote his name and his sister's telephone number in North Platte, where he would be staying the week, and handed it to her. I'm not asking for anything, he said, before she could speak. I know what it is to not be ready. But I also know what it is to sit in an empty house on a Tuesday afternoon with nobody to tell about your day. If you ever want a friend who understands that particular kind of quiet, you have my sister's number. No pressure. No expectations. Just an open door, if you want it. Eleanor took the paper and held it carefully, the way a person holds something they intend to keep. I might take you up on that, she said. Once the tomatoes forgive me. Give it time, Walter said. Everything forgives you, eventually. Even the garden. The train began to slow as North Platte came into view, the small brick station glowing amber under the last of the daylight, and Eleanor gathered her things slowly, unhurried, as if she wanted to make the moment last a little longer than the train schedule allowed. As she stood to leave, she leaned down and, without quite planning to, kissed Walter gently on the cheek, the kind of kiss exchanged between people who understand each other's sorrow without needing to explain it further. Goodbye, husband, she said, smiling. Goodbye, wife, Walter answered. It was a good marriage, while it lasted. She laughed, that same easy, unguarded laugh from before, and walked down the aisle toward the door, Harold falling into step beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder in a way it hadn't in 4 years. Walter watched them go, watched them step down onto the platform together, watched Eleanor turn back once to look at the train, at his window, and lift her hand in a small wave. He lifted his hand back. The train pulled away a few minutes later, carrying him onward through the darkening plains, and Walter sat alone again, as he had at the start of the journey. But it did not feel the same kind of alone. Somewhere out there, he thought, an old man was finally learning to let his daughter-in-law grieve in her own time, and a widow was remembering what her own laughter sounded like, and all of it had started with a small, desperate lie on a train that turned, quite by accident, into something entirely true. He thought about Dorothy, about the 2 coffee cups he still set out most mornings, and for the first time in a long while, the thought did not ache quite so sharply. It simply felt like love, still doing its work, long after the person was gone. 3 weeks later, his sister mentioned that a woman named Eleanor had called the house, asking after him, wondering if Sunday mornings were any good for visitors who brought too much bread. Walter smiled, and said Sunday mornings were about as good as mornings got. And somewhere in Nebraska, a garden of stubborn tomatoes kept quietly growing, as if they, too, had finally decided to forgive.